This episode features Professor Eric Priest, our first non-physicist. Professor Priest is an acclaimed mathematician and also a prominent speaker on the interactions between science and religion. Our discussion covers the overlaps between physics and maths, the interaction of all science and religion, and the differences that Professor Priest has found from his time as a student and today. Enjoy listening! You're listening to Insight, the University of St Andrews Student Physics Society's podcast. I'm your host, Samuel Avery. Join us as we journey into the lives of St Andrews academics, discovering their passions, inspirations, and motivations. Today on Insight, we're very excited to welcome our first non-physicist, Professor Eric Priest. Thanks for joining us.
That's my pleasure, Sam.
So, we're just going to start off a bit about your past. So could you maybe tell us a bit about your positions here at St Andrews and what you do?
Yes, I was appointed in 1968, a long time ago, as a lecturer in applied mathematics, and then was made a professor in 1983, which also seems a long time ago. And then 2010, I retired and became an emeritus professor. However, I still have an office, I still have exactly the same work hours as I ever did. The only difference is I don't get paid for it, but that doesn't matter because I've got a reasonable pension, and it means I also don't have any responsibility, so I can enjoy myself.
That sounds not bad. And
so I just feel I've been very fortunate to come here. I remember the phrase of Confucius is one I like. He said, choose the career you love and you won't have to work a day in your life. And that's what I feel it's been like for me. I've just enjoyed every minute of it. And I specifically, when I left university, had a choice of going into a research institute somewhere, a national research institute, or trying to apply for a university. And I decided to apply for university because I could then do both teaching and research, and both are equally important to me. I've always put a lot of energy into both of them. In fact, I've always described my position as being university teacher rather than professor or researcher or whatever.
Excellent. Sounds a lot less intimidating, university teacher, yeah. So what kind of path led you here then? Which university did you go to when you were a student?
Well, a series of random choices, really. I think, we often come to a fork in the road and it's not obvious which way we should go. I mean, maybe many students will find this when they're trying to decide what career to take up, for example. And I think it's important to become as informed as you can about the different paths, and then just make a decision and go for it and put in all your energies, not look back. You're never going to know what that path's going to be like, what's going to be down the path, but it's important just to really put your energies into it and not regret not having gone on a different path. If it does happen to go pear-shaped, then you can always go back and try something else. So I was at school near Birmingham, and I applied to Nottingham University to do mathematics and physics. And I was offered a place and I accepted it. And then 2 weeks later, I was offered a place in Cambridge. And so I just wrote back to them and said, I'm sorry, I've already accepted somewhere. Because my father had always taught me that your word is your bond, And I've often wondered what would have happened in a different quantum universe if I'd made a different decision there. But anyway, I've been very happy with the choice I did make. So, and then when I was at Nottingham, I became fascinated by the fact that the vorticity of a fluid is the curl of the velocity, and the electric current is the curl of the magnetic field. And I just thought it was weird that you should have these two vector relationships. And so I thought, well, maybe I should go and do something that studies vorticity, or some research doing electric currents. Then I discovered that there was a subject with a huge long name called magnetohydrodynamics, which involved both of them. So I said, I have to do that. And then I discovered that really one of the pioneers of the subject was in Leeds, so I applied to go and do research with him in Leeds, and that's where I ended up. While I was at Leeds, I can remember every summer going on a camp with a group of students and a group of Borstal boys, from young offenders prison, basically. Equal numbers of students and boys, and we used to, for 2 weeks, we'd sleep in a tent, 2 of each in each tent. And that had a big impression on me, because I realised there, but for the grace of God go I, these Borstal boys were the same as me, basically, but their life had gone on unfortunate paths. So I just realised that we're all important, regardless of our background, our status, our religion, our race, our sexuality, or whatever. Each person is important, and that realisation has kept me with me. Anyway, I did an MSc for a year, and then I did 2 years towards my 3-year PhD. Mm-hmm. But then you were only given 3 years worth of money. So I'd used it all up after 2 years of my PhD. And so I decided I would apply for lectureships, and looked in the newspaper, and one came up in St Andrews. I didn't actually know where St Andrews was, but I applied for it, and was interviewed here. And I can remember that vividly, because at the time there was a railway joining Lucas Junction, it was then, to St Andrews. And I stood on the station at Lucas there. This was 1968. The 60s were, really a time of ideas being turned upside down, new ideas coming up all the time. We were fans of the Beatles. We grew up with the Beatles. We all had long hair, and there was a huge noise, the biggest noise I'd ever heard in my life. And I thought, my God, it's a world war. It's the end of the world, because we were all terrified of that. It was in the middle of the Cold War. And then I saw a jet going over, and I didn't know that we were right next to an Air Force base, and realised what it was. So anyway, I breathed a sigh of relief, got on the train, and it wound its way along the Eden Estuary, past the golf courses, and I saw the towers of St Andrews coming up ahead, and it was just like entering a magical world, Narnia or something like that, or Hogwarts, And then I was interviewed in this room called the Hebdomadars room, and I just thought that was so quaint. Anyway, I was offered the job, and I looked around, and I thought, gosh, this is a really remote place, isn't it? I'll move on to somewhere more interesting after a couple of years. But I met my future wife. She was a final year student here, and not in mathematics, I should add. And just fell in love with the place, and I've been really happy here. So that's the kind of path that's led me to where I am at the moment.
Excellent, yeah. So that's really a comprehensive path, choices that led you to your outlook on life and your positions here. Fantastic. So you're a mathematician, obviously, and I'm a physicist, and the two subjects are quite closely linked. I mean, a lot of your work overlaps with astrophysics. So what do you think drives maths and physics together to be so similar and complement each other so well?
Well, am I a mathematician or a physicist? I would say I'm really at the junction between mathematics, physics and astronomy, and often actually the most exciting areas of research are on the junction between different subjects, between chemistry and biology, or biology and physics, or physics and mathematics, and so on. So I have elements of both. I'm an applied mathematician, so I apply mathematical methods to physical problems, setting up theories for physical processes that one can see. But I'm equally interested in the observations and in the physical processes that are going on. So from that point of view, I'm a physicist. I think in applied mathematics is very prevalent in the UK, but not so much in other countries. So in many other countries, America, for example, I would probably be in a physics department. If I'm on an aeroplane and sit next to somebody and they ask me, so what do you do? Then my answer really depends on how sociable I'm feeling. If I don't feel very sociable, I say I'm a mathematician, and they look at me peculiarly and get on with their food. Whereas if I'm feeling sociable, I say I'm an astronomer, and then they ask me about black holes or something like that.
Sounds about right, yeah.
But equally, a lot of the theoretical physics in the general sense of that word, half of that is done in the physics department and half of it is done in applied mathematics, basically. I mean, the solar physics, the fluid dynamics, the biophysics, they're all done here in applied mathematics. So I think the labels you give to things are very flexible, basically.
How has the focus of research changed since you were a student?
The focus of my own research, that's on the sun, applying magnetohydrodynamics to the sun, has changed incredibly. We just know so much more about the observations. And part of the reason why it's so exciting is that there are so many observations, there are so many constraints on our theory. If I were a cosmologist, I could sit down and dream up lots of, fancy ways, but I couldn't test them, basically. There's no way I know of, for example, of testing whether a multiverse is real or not, whether there is a multiverse or not. But with the sun, we have lots of observational constraints, and that's what makes it exciting, to try and produce theories that are consistent with all those observations. So, huge increase in ground-based telescope capabilities and in the number of space satellites. Has made a huge change there. But equally, I think the advances in theory have been driven by the advances in computers. Now we can compute in fantastic ways that we couldn't do before. So it's changed tremendously. I think the sun, I say I'm an applied mathematician applying my mathematical methods. Well, I decided to apply these methods to the sun, but if I get bored with that, or I think I've solved all of the main things I'm interested in, then I'll try and apply the methods to somewhere else. But it doesn't look as if that's going to happen anywhere soon.
Excellent, that's the way you want to keep it.
Yeah, so part of the reason for the fascination about the sun is that many of the key questions about the fundamentals of the sun are unanswered at the moment. There's a magnetic field that's generated in the interior, but we don't know exactly how that generation, that dynamo mechanism takes place. The surface of the sun is only 6,000 degrees, but the atmosphere, the outer atmosphere, is a few million degrees. We know that somehow the magnetic field is heating it, but we don't know the details of how. That's one of the major problems that we're working on here. The outer atmosphere is also expanding outwards from the sun, as it's called the solar wind, and goes to supersonic speeds, and fills the solar system. So basically the Earth is an obstacle that's sitting in this supersonic solar wind that's flowing past it. And we don't know how it's accelerated. That's another key question. Yet another one is the fact that occasionally you get huge eruptions from the sun of mass and magnetic field, and they then interact with the Earth's outer atmosphere and create cell phone dropouts and aurora, and they mean that airplanes have to avoid the polar routes and travel to much lower latitudes. So these are many key questions that we're trying to answer at the moment. And I think when we have discovered the answers, that will have huge impact on the rest of astrophysics, because these fundamental processes are taking place throughout the universe, in other stars, in galaxies, in black holes, and so on. And right at the core of that is the fact that we're dealing with a plasma as you probably know, the plasma is the fourth state of matter. You know, we on Earth here sit in a very unusual bubble of solids, liquids, and gases. You go from one to the other by increasing the temperature. But if you increase the temperature of any gas enough, it will become a plasma. It will become an ionized gas. But we give it a different name just because it behaves so differently. And on the kind of scales that we're looking at on the sun, the key difference is its relation with the magnetic field. So there's a magnetic field in this room, but it has virtually no effect on us. You know, we're really unaware of it unless we happen to have a compass. Whereas in a plasma, the magnetic field and the plasma interact together in very subtle, non-linear, complex ways. So everything the magnetic field does affects the plasma and vice versa. And that interaction is described by these equations of magnetohydrodynamics, which are a unification of the equations of fluid mechanics and Maxwell. And to me, they're the most beautiful thing I know. These equations are just wonderful in their structure and in what we can deduce from them.
Excellent, yeah. So you're really getting a run for your money with these equations, and there's a lot of questions to be solved. But there's a lot of people working on them. Do you maybe have a mathematician who deserves more recognition or an idol in the mathematics community?
I think it very much depends on the particular topic you're looking at. I mean, if you were looking at the theory, dynamo theory, or coronal heating, or solar wind acceleration, or eruptions, then there would be one person that was really dominating that, I would think, or would be a name that everybody would think of. But it's very much an international community. You know, we have lots of collaborations with people all over the world, and international visitors are continually coming here because we're very fortunate that the solar theory group here is one of the very best in the world. I mean, all the solar physicists in the world know about it, and many of them have interacted with us. So it's just a very great privilege to be able to meet people from so many different countries and to engage with them and, you know, cut across any differences you might have.
Yeah, excellent. And in St Andrews, we have good interactions between lecturers and staff and students. But how did you find interactions with lecturers when you were a student? Was it intimidating? Was it friendly? Or?
Yes, I did. I found it pretty intimidating, I think. I mean, the lecturers were distant people. You know, you would approach them in a state of reverence, I think. You know, I mean, I can remember even my supervisor. He was a wonderful old man. I learned a lot from him, but he was very much one of the old school. And I would walk into his office. He would give me an hour and a half every week, and I would walk into his office, and he would say, "Good morning, Priest." And I would say, "Good morning, Professor Cowling. How are you today?" "I'm very well, thank you. How are you today?" It's like a Japanese tea ceremony, you know. And we would sit down, and so it was very formal, but at the same time, he was incredibly helpful. I just learned so much from him. But he had very, you know, he was a very eminent man. He was a fellow of the Royal Society and had done a huge amount and was a major figure in the field. But he published hardly any papers. He published about 20 papers in his career or something. And so I think it was something like 3 years after I'd finished my PhD. I mean, my first year in St Andrews, I had a full lecturing load. I was courting my girlfriend and I was finishing my PhD. So I've never worked so hard in my life. It's been easy ever since.
Possibly worryingly big part of student life is procrastinating. So what's the latest that you've started studying before a test or deadline?
Oh, I tend to be pretty organised, actually. I always like to I always like to do things well in advance, make sure I mean, I was really lucky as a student because I found mathematics really easy. So I would go to lectures in the morning, and the afternoons I would read through the lectures, and I would make sure I understood them, read a few books around the subject. I never ever worked one evening, and I never ever worked on a Saturday or a Sunday, in my whole 3 years as a student. So I just found it very easy. So I was lucky, I think. And so equally, when it was a case of revising for tests, I'd work hard at it in the 2 weeks leading up to it. But, then I'd make sure that I wasn't overtired when it actually came to the test, and I was relaxed. And I've always thought that it's really, tension is good provided it's not too great. I think tension does spur you to your adrenaline to go and you to do things and think more clearly than you could do otherwise. But too much of it is really damaging to your health. And so for me, it's always been important to try and find a way of relaxing, every week, every day. I mean, I never work in the last hour before I go to bed. I always, just, do something relaxing. And I like to do something relaxing every day. Every morning I spend at least half an hour singing, for example. So for me, the two ways of relaxing have been by doing sport. I've always done some exercise. Climbing mountains was in Scotland was one of my keys. I managed to climb all the Munros a few years ago. So
congratulations!
But I've always gone along to the gym and always been involved in tried different sports over the years. So getting exercise for me has been a really important way of relaxing, and also music has been very important for relaxing. I love singing, and I've always enjoyed that. Not terribly good at it, but I enjoy it.
Excellent, yeah. Is there maybe like one thing that's better about being a student now, and possibly one thing that's worse that you could point to?
It's just so different.
Or what do you think?
I think what is worse for students and for young staff actually is that people are under a lot more stress than we ever were. We felt we could go along to lectures we were interested in, and I've never felt under great stress in my job, whereas I think now a lot of the young lecturers are under a lot of stress and a lot of tension. The desire to succeed and to compete. I think competition is a lot greater now. And I think that's a pity, because what it does is to drive people into becoming over-specialised. They just feel, I can only go along to a lecture if it's right on my subject, whereas I've always been interested in a wide variety of different things. And so, for example, whenever there's an inaugural lecture on here, it doesn't matter whether it's history or languages or philosophy or economics or whatever, or chemistry or biology, I always go along to it if I happen to be around, if I'm free. And I always find it interesting and always learn something new. So I think, as well as focusing on your speciality, it's important to keep a general understanding of science as a whole and the relationship of what you're doing to what other people are doing. But these inaugural lectures, that you often see, I would suggest you try and go along to them. You'd find they're usually pitched just at the right level, and they're absolutely fascinating.
That's a good tip. I'll keep that in mind. So you're also quite a prominent speaker on the intersection between science and faith and religion. Was there either faith or fascination with maths that developed first for you?
I think a fascination with mathematics. I mean, nobody in my family had ever gone to church before. I was the first person to become interested in that. And so I think I was developing my mathematics first before I developed an interest in Christianity. And it's interesting because there is, to me, a clear relationship between the two. In other words, the way in which I think and work as a scientist really affects the way I think as a Christian. So being a scientist is not cold and logical, done something by impersonal people in white coats, It involves creativity and leaps of faith. It involves intuition. It involves openness and questioning. and it involves trust in the rest of the scientific community. These aspects are right at the core of what it is to be a scientist. And that in turn leads you to a sense of humility. So if you see a scientist being arrogant, they're not being true to their science, I think. But in the same way, for me, Christianity has the same aspects. So it involves trust and leaps of faith. It often gives me a sense of beauty and wonder, which leads to a sense of humility, and of how it's important that I value and respect other people's beliefs if they're different from my own. Openness and questioning, to me, are right at the core of being a Christian. So just as I'm on a journey of discovery as a scientist, so I'm on a pilgrimage, I'm on a journey of discovery as a Christian. My ideas continue to change. And of course, in that, the sense of community is very important as well. So to me, they're very parallel, very similar to one another.
Yeah, so maths is kind of a tool to understand the universe. And do you think that God intended for maths to be such? And is seeking knowledge and understanding a form of worship then?
I think God reveals himself through normal Christian ways, in other words, through the Bible, through worship. But he equally reveals himself through nature and through what he's created. So I think they're both equally important, actually. When I'm out in the hills walking, climbing up a Munro, I often get a wonderful sense of beauty and the majesty of God. So I think it's really interesting how when you study science, you realise that mathematics underpins the universe somehow. It's weird, isn't it? Why is it that the behaviour of clouds or of rivers or of the sun should be governed by mathematics? It's just weird. And there's a kind of symmetry and elegance in the universe when you look at it in great detail. And so for me, that doesn't prove the existence of God, but it is consistent with it, I think.
Excellent. So as maths it's a very logically grounded subject, and you build up the whole of mathematics from very basic axioms. Has that ever conflicted with your faith or tested your belief?
That's interesting. An interesting question. When I was at Nottingham, I became interested in Christianity and started going along to the chapel services there. And I wondered whether to become confirmed, to become a member of the Church of England, which was the main church then. But I had a problem, and so I went along to a very wise old man, and I said, I'm wondering whether to be confirmed or not, but I have this problem. He said, what's the problem? So I said, well, as a scientist, I can't understand how Jesus could have been resurrected and raised from the dead, could come alive. I can't understand how that could happen as a scientist. So I don't know whether I believe in the resurrection or not. And he said to me, well, what's your attitude to Jesus? I said, well, I've read about him in the New Testament, and I'm just absolutely fascinated by him. I think the things he says, the ideas that he puts forward, really seem to resonate for me. They really seem to be right, and I want to spend the rest of my life following up his ideas and seeing how they work out in practice. And so this wise old man said, well, you've just told me you want to be a Christian, so what's stopping you? So I did then become confirmed, and later on I kind of realised that if God exists, when you start to think about that, that is just an incredible reality if it's true. And so I thought, well, if God does exist, then it would be trivial for Jesus to be resurrected from the dead. So that no longer became an issue for me. still don't understand how it occurred, but there are many things I don't understand in life. And I don't think you can ever prove the existence of God. And I also can't prove to you that my theory of solar flares is correct, right? Mm-hmm. What I can do is discuss with you whether it's consistent with the observations we have at present or not, right? So I can't prove any theory is correct, but I can talk about consistency, and I think the same is true of the existence of God. I can't prove the existence of God. People have tried for centuries and nobody's ever been successful. But what you can do is say, is the existence of God or the non-existence of God more consistent with your experience? And so for me at the moment, the existence of God is more consistent with my experience. It may change in future, but for the moment, and so I'm prepared to live my life under the assumption that he does exist. So my attitude to science then is really affecting the way I think about Christianity.
Mm-hmm. So they're intertwined then?
They're not two separate boxes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Excellent. No, that's really interesting to hear. How do you think that Christianity, or religion in general even, will change moving into the future?
How will Christianity change? Well, in one way, what I hope is that in this century, Christians can have the humility to engage much more with Islam, with Muslims, to dialogue with them, to respect them, to try and understand them. You don't have to agree with them, but I think it's really important that we have contact with them, and that more contact with them, and that we encourage good relationships between the two. We once had these James Gregory lectures that I helped to run. We once had a Muslim who came along and spoke to us, and as I always do, I took him into the local schools, and we had an open session for an hour of questions and answer from the people doing hires. And one of them asked him the question, why do you think Islam is better than Christianity? That's not something I would say, no, but I came out with this question. He said, well, I don't know whether it's better or not. He was a very gentle man. He was a Sufi Muslim and very, obviously, deeply spiritual and, very kind, gentle person. And he said, well, I don't know whether it's better or not. It happens to appeal to me, but that's probably because of my own history. He said, for me, I think as Christians and Muslims, we're on different roads up a mountain and we'll meet at the top somehow. So I found that a very interesting. It's a very simple idea, but a very interesting one. Another example, I was once in Alexandria helping organise a conference to do with an eclipse of the sun that was taking place there. And they asked me to go after the conference to give a talk to young people, so school children, and mainly school children, but also first-year university students. And I thought, oh, that's fine. They wanted me to talk about science and culture. And I thought, oh, there'll probably be about 50 there. And we went along into the new bibliothèque of Alexandria, and there were 850 people there. 2/3 of them were women, all wearing headdresses, And I thought, wow. But anyway, afterwards, they came up to me in small groups to ask me questions. And I can remember one little group in particular, a group of young girls, and it was really noticeable to me that they weren't uniform at all. They each wanted to know the answers to the questions. And also they were wearing their headdresses in different ways. They had different coloured headdresses, wearing them in different ways, just as the way, our teenagers will wear their hair in different ways. Mm-hmm. And they asked me lots of questions. And at the end of that, I said to them, you're Muslims, I'm a Christian. As far as I'm concerned, we're sister religions. And I hope that in this century we can really work together to come to love each other, to appreciate each other, and to agree to live at peace. Those young girls had tears in their eyes. One of them put her hand on her heart and she said, "You make my heart warm. I never thought I would hear words like that. We hear from our media that the West hates us. We hear about Abu Ghraib, Danish cartoons, slaughter in Iraq, in Palestine. The West hates us, and you're telling us something completely different which warms our hearts." So, that's stuck with me ever since and made me feel that I must do all I can in small ways to encourage better relations with Muslims. Because I think if we don't, we're set for disasters in this century. And we really have to try and help moderate-minded Muslims, and help to undermine the extremists somehow. I think.
So the future will be about establishing a dialogue and widening people's learnings across both Christianity and Islam.
I think that's really important. Yeah. A second way, though, I think in which Christianity will change is that I think Christian theology will have to evolve and rethink some of its doctrines in the light of scientific discoveries. Because, as I say, science is revealing us many things about the nature of God. And I think our current understanding is very human in the way it's been set down. Obviously, it's been inspired as well, but I think because of humanity, we've probably misinterpreted or misunderstood some things that God was trying to tell us. So, for example, the doctrine of the fall, people say that, Adam and Eve, they sinned, and so that's why we're all sinners. I just think that's garbage. But I think you can develop an understanding as to why we tend to be selfish, why we go wrong, using understanding evolution of human beings and understanding the nature of psychology. So I think that's what we need to do to improve Christian doctrine in future. And I also hope that Christianity will be able to engage much better with young people.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people have been put off by Sunday school ideas about Christianity and or put off by experiences. And I think that's very unfortunate.
So one final religion question. You spoke yourself about science kind of laying bare the wonders of the universe that God's created and, the majesty of God's creation. But is there more that the church can do for science?
Well, historically the church has done a lot for science. I mean, the founding of the Royal Society in the 17th century was by Christians mainly who were inspired to try and understand the nature of God's universe. So the church has always been actively involved in religion, and so I see. Basically, I feel that the conflict between science and religion is a myth. I don't think it was one that was proposed at the end of the 19th century, and the Galileo conflict was certainly not a conflict between science and religion. It was a conflict between different sciences, actually, and between an arrogant Galileo and the church. So it's a human conflict. It's nothing to do with science and religion ideas. And for me, I think you see, if you look back before the 17th century, scientia and religio were integrated because they were both regarded as virtues. They had different meanings. Scientia meant knowledge and religio meant devotional activities. And they were both regarded as virtues that good people would practice, you see. But then that broke apart in the 17th century with the rise of science and later on in the 19th century with the professionalization of science. So they split apart. But for me, they're now coming back together. So for me, they're not separate. I think in fact, I think I don't think you should talk about science. I think you should talk about the sciences. There's no such thing as the scientific method. There are lots of different methods that we use in science. So I think the sciences, mingle into one another. They merge into one another. Mm-hmm. There's a kind of rainbow tapestry of sciences, basically. That's why, the difference between physics and maths and astronomy is an artificial one, really. But I equally think the sciences merge into the humanities. They merge into psychology, into sociology, and also into theology. I think they're all a rainbow mixture. They're part of an integrated whole. But whereas before the 17th century, it was the fact they were both virtues that united them, what is it that unites them today?
So it's less about
yeah,
what one can do for the other rather than resolving that there is no animosity and difference.
And also understanding that they're part of a whole. So what it is they have in common now is that I think they're both a search for understanding. That's true of all the humanities, and it's true of theology, and it's true of all the sciences. A search for understanding that combines reason and imagination, and both are equally important for us.
Okay, excellent. So we're going to move on to quickfire questions, so you can be a bit quicker about your answers to these, so you don't need to rattle off one-word answers, however. So do you prefer one-off movies or extensive TV shows that you can really delve into?
Oh, I like TV shows because you can really enter into the characters.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a favourite music genre and song? You've said yourself you like to sing quite a bit.
I love singing, but I'm fairly broad in my interests. I love jazz and I love folk music, but I would say classical music, aspects of classical music really appeal to me. I love the songs of Flora and of Purcell, and I would say, well, my favourite piece of music probably is still Handel's Messiah, because I've sung it at least 20 times and it still brings a tingle to my back when I sing it. It's wonderful.
One to belt out in the shower, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have a favourite passage or section of the Bible?
Oh, gosh, there are just so many good passages. I mean, there's a simple little one, actually, in the Old Testament, Ecclesiastes, which just says, there's a time and place for everything. And so I think that's saying to me it's important to immerse yourself in the present and do what is appropriate for the present, whether that's being with someone else or helping someone else or whatever, and not worry about the other things that are around about. It's a very simple.
Mm-hmm. Simple but beautiful sentiment. Do you have a favourite animal?
Dolphin.
Dolphin, excellent.
Yeah.
And are you a dog?
Especially having swam with one.
Oh, right. Wow.
Yeah, and stroked them. They're amazing.
Oh,
and realising just how intelligent they are. They took some dolphins at birth and separated them. Dolphins can recognise, I think it's at least 100 different dolphins by their sound, the noises they make. And they separated two at birth, and I think they brought them back 20 years later, and they recognised each other. I mean, that's just amazing.
That's fantastic. A little more of a closer to home animal, maybe. Dogs or cats? Are you a dog or person or a cat person?
Dogs. Do you know that humans, one thing humans do, and we first did when we looked at each other, when you first look at each other, you look, now, but I've forgotten which side of the face it is, it's either the right or the left side of the face. You automatically look at one side of the face rather than the other. And it's because one side of your face shows your emotions much more than the other. So without realising it, we're intuitively accessing the emotions of the person we look at. Now, no other animal does that to its own species, but dogs do it to humans.
Wow, that's fascinating. I didn't know that. Wow.
So there's a lot of empathy there.
Yeah. Which is your favourite piece of flora? Which is your favourite flower or tree or shrubbery?
Oh, it has to be the redwoods in California. They are just so majestic. They've lived for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and you just feel a sense of awe in their presence.
Yeah, they're definitely grand stature. What is your drink of choice?
It depends how I'm feeling. Sometimes it will be ginger beer. Sometimes it will be a nice dark beer, and sometimes it'll be a glass of red wine. So it all depends what I'm feeling. All depends on the
setting, yeah. But is there a definitively best condiment if you're having a meal? Are you going to go for the ketchup, the
pepper,
mayo?
I always put pepper on. Yeah. But that's because I'm getting older, and your taste isn't quite as good, so you need something to help your taste buds along when you're older. It'll come to you eventually.
Something to look forward to. Do you have a favourite type of chocolate?
Dark chocolate, yeah.
Good choice. Do you have a favourite scientific communicator?
David Attenborough, it has to be. I just think that it's interesting because he's not a Christian, but through his programs, he's just filled me with such a feeling of awe about the beauty and diversity of nature.
He's very good at what he does, yeah.
Absolutely. And I've met him several times, and he's a real joy to meet too. So
wow.
I've been fortunate.
Yeah, quite the claim to fame. Do you have a favourite non-academic book?
Non-academic book? Yeah, there's one by Desmond Tutu, which I absolutely love. And then there's another that I've recently read by Jonathan Sacks called Not in God's Name, in which he really just gave so many insights into the nature of the current conflict with Islam. And he says that whenever people kill in the name of religion, the still small voice of God says, "Not in my name." That's why the title of the book.
And to finish us off, this is not a quickfire question. Do you have any advice for young scientists struggling to reconcile conflicting beliefs that they have?
Well, I think it's important to recognise that there are different kinds of questions. Scientific questions and non-scientific questions. And in fact, to me as a scientist, the non-scientific questions are just as important as the scientific questions, sometimes more important. So there are many aspects of my life as a human that I can't answer with science. The nature of beauty, Why do I think that sunset is so beautiful? Love, when I'm in love with I am in love with my wife. I'm very fortunate. What is my purpose in life? What should I do with my life? These are kinds of questions that science has no answers to. But Christianity can help you address them. And that's partly why I think you need both science and Christianity. So I think recognizing that there are different questions and really searching for the wonder and the beauty in both, I think, is important. I also think it's important to try things. I mean, if you've belonged to church or have had bad experiences in church, then try it out again, and try it for a few weeks, and try and get to know people and discuss with them, because often you'll find that your beliefs are much more similar to them than you thought they were. So I think engaging is important. One of the barriers, I think, to advancement in our society is polarization, where people just refuse to talk or listen to each other. It's important that we listen in humility and we share. So, don't know whether that helps or not, but
well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking, so thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sam.
You've been listening to Insight, the University of St Andrews Student Physics Society's podcast. I was your host, Samuel Lavery. Thanks to all the wonderful academics of St Andrews. Join us in the future as we learn more of the people making our education. This podcast was produced by myself and our publicity officer, Connor McBride. To find out more about the Physics Society and what we do, please find us on Facebook or Google St Andrews Physics Society for our website. Goodbye!